Hello, everybody. Welcome to 5, 6, 7, 8, episode 8 of Going Places. Today, I am here with Dee, all the way from Australia.
Hi, Beth. Hi, everyone. My name is Dee Ninis, and I'm an earthquake scientist working at the Seismology Research Centre here in Melbourne, Australia. And I look at earthquakes in their squiggly line form, so seismic waveform data when we record earthquakes. And I also study the deformation that larger earthquakes often produce in the landscape. And today I'm going to share results of one of the latter studies, some pretty neat outcomes of a geomorphology study which I undertook of the Wellington Fault in New Zealand. So let's fly to New Zealand. Okay, so some of you may need reminding. New Zealand sits at a plate boundary. Offshore here, offshore of the eastern side of the North Island, the Pacific plate's being subducted. It's being dragged beneath the Australian plate. And at a latitude of the southernmost North Island here, that subduction is happening at a rate of about 40 millimetres a year. Now, part of this plate motion is accommodated by movement on a number of active strike-slip crustal faults, so faults in the upper plate, and the Wellington Fault is one of these structures. So I'm going to zoom into Wellington now. Wellington is the capital city of New Zealand and my former home. I lived there for 10 years. Now you can see this feature here, this lineament. This is the Wellington Fault. So it extends from offshore here, offshore in Cook Strait. It passes through Wellington. It forms the northwestern side of Wellington Harbour and continues northeast for about 80 kilometres. And previous ground rupturing earthquakes on this fault have essentially left this scar in the landscape, what we see here. And it's the reason why we can identify the Wellington Fault in aerial imagery. Now, there have been a number of studies on the Wellington Fault in order to better understand the hazard posed by this structure. For instance, there have been several paleoseismology studies. Now, with these studies, we're looking for evidence of ancient earthquakes on the fault. Paleo comes from the Greek word paleo, which means old or ancient. And I'm just going to bring up a couple of images now so you see how we undertake these investigations. So we basically dig a trench across the fault in order to expose subsurface evidence of previous ground rupturing earthquakes. So here I am here. This was the first trenching investigation that I was involved in on the Wellington Fault, and I was pretty happy. And in order for me to tell this story about the Wellington Fault, I need to refer to data from some other studies as well. So I'm going to introduce these three people here because these guys were involved in the other studies of the Wellington Fault that I'll be referring to today. In fact, they've done heaps of studies on the Wellington Fault. They know the Wellington Fault really well. So sitting down here is Tim Little from Victoria University of Wellington. And this is Russ Van Dissen and Rob Langridge from GNS Science. And so the results of these paleoseismology trenching investigations have provided us with information on previous ground rupturing earthquakes in the Wellington Fault and when they've occurred. So for instance, we now know that there have been about 4 ground rupture earthquakes on the fault in the last about 4,500 years. The most recent was around 300 years ago. Prior to that, around 850 years ago, and before then it was about 2,200 years ago. So I'm going to take you now to a site in Upper Hutt, which is northeast of Wellington. This nice green farmland here. We zoom in close enough, you can even see cows grazing. So this is an area of preserved river terraces. The flat areas here are ancient river beds, and these features that you can see are the terrace rises. They're ancient river banks. So through time, what's happened is the river has cut into the landscape, it's incised into the landscape, and it has abandoned the former riverbed and riverbank and created a new one at a lower elevation. And that process repeated leaves behind a sequence of river terraces in a stepped-like pattern. I'll just flick up a figure. No, I don't have it there, so I can't show you. So basically it's a step-like pattern in the landscape, and the higher the terrace is in the sequence, the older it is. Now, if I zoom in even closer, you can see that, especially on the terrace rises, you can see they've been offset by the Wellington Fault here and here and here. So the Wellington Fault cuts through these terraces through here. And the neat thing about the displacements at this site is that they're all multiples of 5 metres. So this is telling us that when the Wellington Fault ruptures, when it produces a ground rupturing earthquake, each earthquake produces a horizontal displacement of 5 metres at this site. So this terrace riser here, displaced by 5 metres, captures the last ground rupturing earthquake on the Wellington Fault. These two here are 15 metres offset each, so they represent 3 ground rupture earthquakes, and this one here is offset by 20 metres, so that represents 4 ground rupturing earthquakes. And in addition to these displacements being measured, these terraces were also dated. So we know, for instance, that this terrace here with the 20-metre displacement is 4,500 years old. So there's been 20 metres of displacement in the last 4,500 years. And this displacement and age data can give us the slip rate of the Wellington Fault, and that tells us how active the fault is. So this investigation was just being wrapped up when I first arrived in New Zealand, and it was my job to investigate the terraces on this side of the river, just here. Now, these terraces were higher in elevation, so we knew that they were older, but we didn't know how old they were. So one of the objectives of my study was to date these terraces and find out how old they were. In addition, as you can see, the area has been developed into housing. So all of the original topography, all of the original fault offsets had been destroyed in the process of building these houses. So I employed a technique called photogrammetry that basically involved me going out there and finding as many sites as I could that hadn't been modified and surveying these sites. And together with historical aerial imagery, which I'll bring up now, we were able to create digital elevation data for this site. So new data of the old topography. Now, definitely the most interesting results from my investigation came from these two offsets here, this one here and this one here. Now, this terrace here is about 10,000 years old, and it's been displaced by 55 metres. And the terrace directly beneath it in the sequence is 8,000 years old, and it's been displaced by 25 metres. So we can say then that between 10 and 8,000 years ago, there's been 30 metres of offset on the Wellington Fault. And since that time, since 8,000 years, there was 25 metres of offset. Now, you might already be thinking back to what I said just a little bit earlier about the last 20 metres of offset being dated as having happened in the last 4,500 years. So that's kind of intriguing, because if you do the math, it basically means that there's only been 5 metres of offset on the Wellington Fault between 8 and 4,500 years ago. So even when we consider the uncertainties associated with the displacement measurements and the age measurements, there's really strong evidence to suggest that past activity on the Wellington Fault has not been constant through time. The Wellington Fault experienced a period of heightened activity around 10 to 8,000 years ago, and then it quietened down a bit. It had a bit of time out between 8 and 4,500 years ago. And of course, we have the dated trench data, which tells us that there have been 4 earthquakes on the Wellington Fault, 4 ground rupturing earthquakes in the last 4,500 years. So there you have it, some compelling evidence of variable slip on the Wellington Fault. And I'm just going to finish off by saying that this work was funded by New Zealand's Earthquake Commission, and the data is now being considered in seismic hazard estimates for the Wellington region.
Thanks so much, Dee. So that's really amazing, because we're able to see, so from my perspective, I work with GPS, these high precision ways to measure how the ground is moving now. So we'd be able to put out instruments to see how the fault is moving now, or how that land's moving now. But what you were able to do is look back over thousands of years to see how the faults moved in the past. And so if we were to look, have GPS thousands of years ago and be able to on the fault, like jumping through time, we'd see different rates of motion, right? It hasn't been moving the same the whole time. And you were able to see that by looking at these offsets, or where the land had moved in past earthquakes.
Absolutely. It's pretty neat, huh?
That's really great. Thank you so much for sharing with us the story of the Wellington Fault.
Thanks, Beth.